Okay, I'm going to be working on this last petal, and I'm going to be showing you how to give it this nice texture and how to do the shading. So first thing we're going to do is we want to fill in the petal with the background color, which is this darker color. For this specific flower, if you're doing another color of flower, you're just going to pick the most dominant color and you're going to start with that. So my most dominant color in this flower is the darker color. And I'm gonna be using a satin stitch, sort of. It's a version of the satin stitch, but it's a little more messy. So I'm gonna start in the center of my flower and I'm gonna go to the tip of the petal. This tip of the petal is cut off, so I'm gonna go where I think it would be. You can see how I had started in the middle on other petals and went to the very tip of them on these ones. Start in the middle and go to the very tip. I just like to start there first so I kind of can gauge which direction to stitch the petals in. Then I'm gonna kind of work towards the outsides of the petal so I can kind of have a frame for this petal shape. So I've got my middle stitch in. Now I said it's a satin stitch because you kind of work from one end to the other. Because I don't want to waste so much thread on the back, instead of coming all the way back down to the bottom like you typically would with a satin stitch, I'm just going to pick one spot over on the side. So I'm going to come over here. This is so I'm not wasting as much thread on the back. And instead I'm going to stitch down. So now I'm kind of shaping my petal. So I'm working on the little outside of the petal to kind of figure out where I want it to, how I want the edges of the petal to look. So I'm working on this side. And I kind of like to think of this as like coloring. You're just using thread to color in the lines. But maybe you can think of it as like coloring with marker, where you want the lines to all be straight, going the same direction, so that it looks neat. So I like how the side of my petal is looking over here, so now I'm going to go to the other side and give the other side some shape. Okay, so I like that. So now I've got both sides of my petals done. So now I'm just going to work on doing stitches to fill in the rest of the space, and I'm just going to kind of follow these lines so that they fan out evenly. Now I said earlier that it's going to be kind of a messy satin stitch, and what I mean by that is I'm going to pull the thread up, but then maybe on this next stitch I'm not going to go all the way to the top. I'm going to stop right here. I'm just filling it in part way right there, but then maybe I'll go all the way to the top this time and bring it back down, maybe part way back down. The reason I do this is because it really helps with the texture of the petals and just makes them look more free, but at the same time there is a concise and there's a pattern that you can see because they are still all flowing the same direction. And I'm gonna just keep going like this until I fill in the entire petal. And sometimes I will just go from one end of the petal all the way to the other end. I just do some of both, some short stitches, some longer stitches. And just a little tip, as I mentioned earlier, as I'm stitching, I'm thinking to myself, where can I put the needle next so that I'm not wasting so much thread on the back, because that can be kind of frustrating, at least to me, when I'm stitching. If I turn it over, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's half the thread on the back. I don't know, it feels kind of wasteful to me. So I like to place my needle in ways where I know I won't be wasting a ton of thread on the back. So we've got this petal all filled in. So the next step I'm ready for is the shading. So for this particular flower, I've decided to do a lighter color for the shading, depending on what color scheme you've chosen or you're doing. You might have a darker color or a lighter color. So for this part, you're gonna just use some artistic license, and you're going to shade in the center part of your petal. If you're following one of my patterns, I've given you some guidelines on where to do the shading, so you can kind of follow those as well. I like to just eye it and do what looks good to me. So I'm gonna start at the base of my petal, and I like to start in the center. And I'm gonna go up about as far as I think I want the shading to go. So that looks about good to me. And I'm gonna pull through that stitch. So now I kind of have a gauge about how tall I want the shading to go. And I'm just gonna kind of fan outwards and work back towards the center. So, and I'm gonna be going a little lower this time. So the middle is the tallest part, and then the sides, the stitches get shorter. And again, I'm just gonna bring it back to the center. This, again, like the petals, is kind of like a free stitch. Doesn't have to be exact. Just kind of goes where you think it's gonna look best. So I'm just filling it in. You can kind of watch how I'm choosing where to put my stitches. And there's really no right or wrong way to do this. It's honestly just whatever you think looks good. But this is kind of the technique that I've chosen. And you can overlap stitches, you can do some shorter and longer, just to kind of give it that nice texture. I feel like I have some gaps right here that I don't love as I'm looking at it, so I'm gonna fill those in with some taller stitches. And maybe some on this other side as well. I do like to have some of the darker color kind of seeping into the lighter color to kind of let them blend together. I think I'll add one more small stitch over here with a little space in between, so that there's a little bit of the red, darker color showing between it. And I think maybe I'll do one other short stitch on the other side. And I like the way that looks for myself. So I'm gonna stop there with the shading. And that is how you do the shading of these flower petals.